So today we're going to be making the cuff latch, and we're going to be I'm going to do a tutorial on top stitching, and then we have a request for intersecting seams. So that is our work for the day. So I guess before we start the work, are there any questions, comments, requests?
I have one thing. I'm still worrying about what kind of fabric I'm going to use. I came into the city this week and I didn't find anything. But could you tell me if you had to sew there? I'm looking for a light pink or a light blue, and there's something that I see on the web called wool twill flannel, and then the other one's called gabardine wool. Is it the same?
Sort of. Gabardine, stay away from it. Gabardine is extremely fussy in the pressing.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would recommend against that. The wool twill flannel. Is there any way you could get a swatch of it?
Yes, I can.
I would ask for a swatch of both and see. But the gabardine, I don't know about any of you. You know, there is this gabardine is, if you even look at it wrong, it will get shine.
Yes, I know. I sewed with it maybe 40 years ago, and I vowed I would never, but then I said, well, this is wool gabardine. No difference, right?
No, it's just,
I'm staying away from it.
Fabric, yeah. Now there is a kind of a related fabric, if you merino wool sateen.
Yeah.
This it has a little more of a sheen to it. It's a fabric that could go from day into evening. I've made garments out of it in the past. That is not quite as likely to pick up shine.
Right. Okay.
So, if you're looking for something with that sort of surface texture, that would be the way to go. There is a place called Graby Woolen Company, Grabie. I don't know if they're still in business. This is 100 years ago, and I bought from them. But Graby Woolen Company had just this marvelous wool sateen. It came 60 inches wide. It wore like iron, and it just was wonderful to work with.
All right, I'll look it up. Thank you.
Okay, so now I see, Mary, do you have a question? You need, turn on your microphone, please.
Thing on.
Okay, there we go.
Vicki, have you tried Emma One Sock?
Yeah, give her a
try.
try.
I haven't. Thank you.
You can put the color you want in there, I think, and it'll come up with options. But Emma One, all her fabrics are really good.
All right, I always forget about her. I've spent like maybe 5 hours this week online looking at fabric, and then I went into the city one day to look, and I'm sick of it.
Yeah.
But I will check out it. Thank you.
Nothing like yes, Angela, go ahead.
Since I often get confused, I wanted to see if you had a list of steps of how we put this together.
Well, if you just follow kind of how, if you follow how the class is involved, something like that. Yeah, but
okay.
you don't have to guess anything. I'm going to tell you the whole way to put this together.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean
great.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the point of the class, is that, if you follow the lessons as we go through the class, you will have all the information you need to assemble this jacket.
And I'm sorry about my dogs on you in just 2 seconds.
It's okay, not to worry.
They like to bark. Okay.
Okay, so other questions, comments, requests? Okay, so let us begin. We are going to start with the cuff latch. Then from there, we're going to move to my top stitch tutorial, and then we're going to finish up with the intersecting seams. So let us begin. Top stitch, cuff latch. So here we are. And let me collapse this down. So there it is. Okay. And we are off and running. So here we have the pattern for the cuff latch, and we have the lining and the face fabric cut. The lining I cut on the bias, and the face fabric I actually cut on the cross grain so that the texture would match with the texture of the sleeves on the coat. So this is the pattern. These are the pieces. Now, let's get busy. Since we cut both pieces out of the same pattern piece, we want to actually shave 1/8 of an inch off of each edge on the lining so that the seams will favor to the inside. So what that looks like here is not a lot. Try to work with a sharp rotary cutter. So 1/8 of an inch off each edge, just fine. So next, we want to pin these two right sides together. You can see that I pinned one side first, and I like pin basting rather than pinning perpendicular. I find you get more control. So the easy way to get these two edges to match is just to fold this over, and you can see when you fold it over, the edges automatically match. So again, pin based all along. So there we are. And then we can come back here and match that corner. And then you're just going to ease the face fabric slightly onto the lining. When you're favoring, that is what you do. I like having the lining, which is going to be the smaller of the pieces, together. I like the lining pinned on the top, because that way the feed dogs on the machine will do the work. Now, before I go over to the machine, what I have done, since we're using 1/2 inch seam allowances, I marked there. I want to know that intersection, because there's a little trick I'm going to show you when we get over to the machine so that we can actually turn that corner and pull it tightly when we turn it right side out. Now, this is a little trick that I use to turn my corners. I'm using white thread because it's a little easier to see. Normally I would use something that matches. This is buttonhole thread, or Mara 30. So what I want to do here is I want to make a little tiny loop right at that corner. So when I pull the stitch, what I will eventually do then is thread this into the needle. So you have both ends of the thread going through the needle. So it's going to create a loop. It's actually challenging when you're doing it through a camera. Okay, so here we have the thread. And on the back, you just see a little tiny stitch. And like I said, if it were in the same color as what you're sewing on, you really wouldn't notice it. So then I like to come in here and bury that right there, and tunnel it between the layers and have it emerge somewhere out here. So this then that point there, it kind of ties that off so that when we sew, and I'm going to show this running through the machine, we will sew right up to there with short stitches, one across, and then sew back This way, when we turn it right side out, we'll use this to pull this corner tight. So now, let's put this under the machine and sew. Seam allowances are 1/2 inch. Stitch length is your standard 2.5. As we work up to the corner here, I like to shorten the stitch to 0.5 to 0.75. You want a very short stitch as you're going around these corners. Oh, there we are. Good. Okay. Lengthen it again. I generally shorten and lengthen about 1/4 inch from where we turn. Okay, so now this is where get a better look at this. So this stitch length is 0.5, 0.75. Turn. Stitch one. Yeah, I should give it 2. And then about 1/4 inch or so, and then lengthen the stitch back to your standard 2.5. Now, one of the things I'm going to show you as we're sewing the second side, see how I fold that? That's going to, it'll sort of reinforce the favoring. Let me show you the result. Extremely short stitches there and here. An extremely short stitch at these corners makes it so that you can trim close and you can turn it, and you don't have to worry so much about the fabric bursting at the corners. Next, the pressing table. Before we trim, good idea to press everything.
Sorry, it might be a little noisy.
And this may seem counterintuitive, but since I want to press these seam allowances open, it really is easier to press the seam allowances open before you trim these corners. So what that's going to look like, this is where you want your point presser. And you have to press this in sections. So there we are. See, it is easier to manage. You have an entire seam allowance. And you just open it up and press it a little at a time. And we turn it over, press the other side. And you can see here, far easier to press it open before you trim all those seam allowances. Okay, so we have now both seam allowances pressed. That out of the way. This is where we trim. So here, So you can get within about 1 millimeter of that stitching. See, this is where some people get a little shy, but that's why you have short stitches there, so you can trim quite close in there. So then again, start a steep angle here and steep angle here. But you want to remove as much bulk as you can get out of there. So there you have a little extra trim there. There. There's one. Now let me trim the other. This doesn't, you don't have to trim quite so much because it's a flat angle. There. So next, I will turn this right side out. When you're starting to turn this right side out, at this point, you just want to start it with the point turner just to get it going. And then you can use the heel end of the point turner to push everything through. And what I'd say is don't let it bunch up too much here. It might mar your fabric. So once you can get a hold of it here, then you can turn it right side out. So now, this angle here, I'm just going to slip the point turner back in and just make that a nice point. And then here, before you use your thread, you want to turn it as much as you can before you rely on the thread. But then this is where, okay, sorry about that. This is where the thread comes in. You can see here it is. Now, what you're just going to do is gently, gently give it a pull. And it may break, it may not, but there you have it. A nice, crisp edge. Let me give this a press, and I'll show you the results. I like to press it from the back. And now you can see how the seams are favoring towards the lining. Now, notice that little corner here. Not as crisp as I would like, so I'm going to show you another little trick for making it press more crisply. Again, with your buttonhole thread, you use this, then I'm going to press this without the pressing claw so you can see what I'm doing here. So take both ends and you pull. And there you go. I might do it on this one too, just to reinforce that. So, sorry. So there you go. You have nice, crisp corners. Now, let's go back to the work table. And here we have the cuff latches. Now I'm planning on a top stitch, but I'm going to cover the top stitching later, so I will set these aside. We're finished with the cuff latches. So, questions?
Could you use both sides, the face fabric and not face and lining, or do you want the lining for the?
I like the lining because it reduces bulk. You know, it makes for a flatter cuff latch. If you want to use both sides, I have seen both sides used in coats, so both are correct. Okay, so other questions? Crickets. Yes.
Kenneth, I had one about bulk as well. I noticed that you trimmed at the corners, but didn't trim along the horizontal seams. Is there any advantage in doing that, or do you think that's unwise?
Well, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I don't think it's absolutely necessary. If it were a wider seam allowance, I would trim that down. You could
Okay.
trim the lining down to 1/4 of an inch if you really wanted to.
Mhm. And tell me, does the use of kind of cutting off an 1/8 at the beginning, does that essentially avoid any need to do any understitching to kind of turn it to keep everything at the back? Is that the advantage of doing that?
Yeah, you see, the favoring bit, when I studied with my teacher, one of the things she was very big on is that in the pattern you built in the favoring. So for example, if you had a neck facing, you shaved off that 1/8 of an inch on the neck facing so that when you put the two pieces together, the fabric would want to roll back. And so, in this particular case, we just sort of did it after the fact when we cut the lining piece. But I definitely recommend that, because otherwise it's always going to fight, especially the lining will kind of fight to want to come out over the edge. So, really what you're doing is you're making the lining smaller so that physics prohibits it from going any further.
Mm. So that's a general sewing practice for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. That's really useful.
Okay, so other questions? Okay, so now a tutorial on top stitching. Tutorial on top stitching. Here we are. And again, don't be shy about asking questions if you have them, because that's what I'm here for. I'd like to take a few minutes for a top stitch tutorial. These here are samples of different kinds of top stitching. So I will be outlining them shortly, but I wanted to just point them out. So beginning over on our left, this is top stitching thread with single threads, just the regular top stitching you have in your machine. The next one to it is top stitching where we have 2 threads in the needle. We can either put the 2 threads in the needle, or we can use what's called a double-eyed needle, which you'll get to see in a moment. Moving on. This is what I call my top stitching machine. This is sewn with buttonhole thread or top stitch thread on the needle and on the bobbin. And I will talk about how you achieve that particular look. Then there's also hand sewing. These are 3 examples. The first one here is what's called a saddle stitch, which is basically a running stitch. Next to it is a hand pick stitch. And finally, the big finish is one that is called a chain stitch. This is a thread embroidery stitch, and I'm using a thread called ribbon floss. So we have all of these examples here, which I'm going to show you how to do. We have a lot to work on, so let's get busy. We will start the lesson on top stitching with a sample. This is roughly 4 inches. This is roughly 7 inches. I've sewn it together. So this could be the front of a jacket. This could be your collar. This could be really any kind of edge. But I think having this particular sample and then progressing from there so you can see the different examples of top stitching is the way to go. The first example I'm going to show you is just a straight from the machine top stitch. Now you notice here I have used disappearing chalk, and I have marked the chalk line 3/4 of an inch from the edge. That is a personal preference, but that is what I'm going to be using in this particular lesson. So first, let's go to the machine and see just a regular top stitch. For the standard top stitch, you could either use your regular presser foot or you could use the walking foot. Since this fabric is thick and a little bit spongy, I'm choosing to use the walking foot. So obviously I'm using contrasting threads so you can see what I'm up to. But as a rule, for tailoring, you want a longer top stitch rather than a shorter one. It looks better. It also, if you have a shorter top stitch, it could gather the fabric. It kind of compresses it this way, and you can have puckers. So I'm sewing at a 4.0 stitch. So this is what it looks like before pressing. I will go to the pressing table, give it a press, and bring it back here. After pressing, which makes the chalk disappear, here you have just a standard top stitch, entirely respectable, but there are others. The next option for top stitching is having 2 threads threaded through your needle. Now, I would recommend you look at your machine's owner's manual to see how you do this. On the Bernina, you have one going through the final thread guide. You have one outside of it to keep them from getting tangled. The stitch length, again, is standard 4.5. Let's just sew this so you can see the difference. You can make the stitch a little longer if you wish. The general rule here is the longer the stitch, the better it reads. That's just something to keep in mind. Show you the result. Now let me go over to the pressing table and press this out, and I will bring it back so you can see the finished stitching.
And Kenneth, excuse me, for that one, you also use the same thread in the bobbin, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And also, Kenneth, you mentioned that your personal preference is 3/4 of an inch. Is that kind of because then you won't worry about catching the seam allowances?
Yes, but see, this is one of those things where I would say, you know, depending on your fabric and such, make a sample to see if that actually works for you. Okay, other questions? This is my assistant. She's wearing it. This is taken about a year ago, so she's wearing last season's clothing. Of needles that you can use if you're using 2 threads through one needle. It's called a double-eyed needle. It's just fun to know these things. I don't see them very often. As you can see, it is a needle with 2 eyes. So if you can't make 2 threads in your needlework, my assistant says, try this one. So there you
I had a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, so I got a little confused on the threads there. So on the top, were you using 2 top stitching threads?
Well, no, just 2 regular threads from your
Regular thread. Okay,
Yeah.
and regular thread on the bobbin.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
okay.
so it will look different from the front and the back. That is
Mhm.
that's something to know.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Stitching. Now, just to compare to the last one, just so you can see, it's a subtle difference, but important. It's good to know both. You can use both. So these are 2 machine top stitches. This is where my assistant says that not all machines are equal. This particular machine is called a Singer 301A. And for top stitching, as much as I adore my Bernina, it does not like top stitching thread. So what you want to do is you want to use a top stitching needle. And the Singer 301A, also the Featherweight does the same thing. You can actually put the buttonhole thread or top stitching thread in the needle and in the bobbin, and you make a top stitch that looks the same from both sides. Allow me to demonstrate. You can see this threads right to left. I set this on the longest stitch that the machine will make. I find that that's quite attractive. And let me just let it rip and show you what. You don't have a walking foot, but you can get a walking foot for this. Look at that. Is that not beautiful? I'm going to turn it over. And it looks the same from both sides. I will go steam this out and bring it back and show you the result. So here we are. Is that not a thing of beauty? So as they say, sometimes old school is better. And in this particular case, one of these old singers is just the ticket. So if you have one hanging around your workroom, you're all good. You can, some machines will accept the buttonhole thread or the top stitching thread in the needle and the bobbin. Some won't. It's good to have an alternative. For the hand stitching, we're going to wind buttonhole thread or Mara 30 onto the bobbin and have that in the bobbin case. Get this into the bobbin. I will install this into the machine and we will proceed. Now that we have the buttonhole thread in the bobbin, the next thing we want to do is loosen the top tension. It doesn't have to be completely loose, but you want the threads to drop down below the surface of the fabric. The white thread is the buttonhole thread. I'm setting the stitch length on the longest stitch. And then, so right next to where I want the top stitch, the top stitches will fall on the chalk line. You don't want to sew through the stitching you're putting down now. This is just a guide. So here, this is what it looks like from this side, and turning the work over, you can see the orange thread. What that means is that the bobbin thread is tighter than the top thread, which is looser. This will make it so that it's so easy to get this stitching out after you've sewn your hand stitches. This is the setup for the pick stitch and the saddle stitch. I would leave the chalk in, and then after everything is sewn, we'll take out the machine basting and then steam to get rid of the marks. So what I'm using this for, this machine marking with the bobbin thread, is a couple of hand stitches. The first one is the saddle stitch. So what you can do is you can use the stitch length. You can choose one stitch, you can choose 2 stitches, and you can enter and exit the fabric on those 2 stitches. Now you see I've used embroidery floss here. I'm using all 6 plies just so it reads. So what I would recommend is make a sample before you actually do this. And so you can see I'm coming out right on, and you can have it exactly on. And going back to the other side. Now this here, what this will create is something that reads well from both sides. So that's something to think about. If you want to use this on something like a collar, having something that reads from both sides is a little better. So I will sew a couple more, and then I will take it off camera and give it a steam and bring it back. So that's where we are so far. I will meet you back here in just a moment. And here we are. We have steamed the marks out. Now, the reason I loosened the upper tension was so that the upper thread would sit below the fabric. So this is where I come in and clip a few times. And then you can just take this thread out like so. Don't try to pull it all out at once. I don't think it works quite as well, but clipping it in a few places is going to allow you to remove the thread easily. Go back here. A little hiccup here, but that's okay. Here we are. So now we turn it over and grab the thread like so. Now I will go back and give it another little bit of steam to get rid of all of those marks on the fabric, and I will bring it back here. And here we have the result. Perfectly spaced saddle stitching. This is on the front, that is on the reverse. Ain't it beautiful? Next, pick stitching. For the next one, which is the pick stitch, I'm using 4 plies instead of 6. And again, we're going to use the stitches as our spacing, but the pick stitch is a little tiny back stitch. So I'm going back about 1 millimeter and forward 2 stitches. And that again, you would make a sample and decide what spacing that you wanted on this. Now this is not something that reads as well from the back, but it's considered a respectable finish. So a couple more, then I'll show you the result. It's actually quite pretty. If you use an embroidery floss that has a little bit of sheen that matches the fabric, it's quite beautiful. So there is how it appears on the front. There's how it appears on the back. Again, not as pretty as the saddle stitch, but if you match the thread and keep the collar down, no problem. I will go off camera and finish the rest of this row and bring it back here. So here is the result. And I'm going to take the stitches out before I press this time to save a step. This is the easiest way to mark. Buttonhole thread, top stitching thread in the bobbin. And take this out. So that's what it looks like before steaming. I will bring it back afterwards to show you the finished product. And here we are. Pick stitching. So you have 2 options here in the hand stitching for top stitches. Saddle stitch, and you have the pick stitch. It is up to you as the designer which one you'd like to use. What I have decided to use for the top stitching on the garment I'm working on right now is called ribbon floss. It is a fancy thread woven on the bias in rayon. It's kind of shiny. I've decided I want to make a chain stitch, so I'm going to show you what that looks like. So you anchor your thread. And again, using your stitch length as your guide, I'm using 3 stitches here. 3 stitches. And then pass the thread over the needle. And you just continue. You come back, go back in where the needle emerged. And so 3 stitches. And it doesn't matter whether you cast the thread right to left, left to right, it doesn't really matter. Just be consistent. And so yes, we're catching both layers of fabric. So you're going to see this from the reverse. You'll see what that looks like in a few minutes. And you'll notice that it's kind of springy. It's rayon. It seems to have a life of its own. But for something that has a high texture, this really does the trick. So this is a chain stitch. And if you really want to, what you could do is just sew the machine stitch in the matching color and sew this chain stitch over it. And that chain stitch or the machine stitch would disappear. So you really don't need to, if you don't want to, take this chain stitch or take the machine stitch out. I'm getting my terms confused. So I will go off camera and sew down to the end because there's a way of securing that end. So I'm at the end here. I'm going to stop my stitch. So you bring thread over the needle again, and then you stitch down into the fabric. You want to tie that last loop down in place, because if you just let it hang out, the whole thing will unravel. This is a chain stitch. Then you would secure it on the back. And I like to bury the end of the thread here. So this is how it looks. I will go off camera and unravel all of the machine basting and steam it and bring it back here so you can enjoy. And here we have the results. Now, when you're using this, you want to make sure to consider which direction the stitch sews in, because as you can see, it is kind of a one-directional stitch. This is what it looks like from the back, but if you're working on a highly textured fabric, that really shouldn't show. So there you have it, the chain stitch with ribbon floss. So there you are. Questions? Yes, Mary.
There. Would you not recommend putting interfacing in there so you get a better feel of what the layers would be?
I don't understand the question.
So when you're making your sample, you just have 2 tops or 2 pieces of fabric.
Oh, yes.
When you're doing your jacket, you're going to have a piece of interfacing in
Yeah,
there.
it could. Yeah,
correct?
that.
So
Yeah.
would you suggest that that's a
Yes, I
better-
think that's a good idea. Recreate the condition that you're going to be making
Okay,
on
thank you.
on your little sample. Yes. So other questions? Yes, Anne.
Number one, this is giving me flashbacks to embroidering my jeans in the 70s.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
I was thinking about, with the lapel.
Yes.
So if you do like a chain stitch, I mean, I can see, the saddle stitch will look the same on both sides, but both the pick stitch and the chain stitch, would you just say, to heck with it, go with it on one side, or would you at some point get tricky and then, say, okay, end it here and then pick it up so that you get the chain stitch?
Well, what I did on this coat was where it came down to here, there was a point right where the break was that there was chain stitch on the face, but then on the back, there was chain stitch that went down the center front. So there's going to be a point where you
They're
would have
overlapping.
chain stitch overlapping on both sides. So
Okay.
yeah, so that it, you don't have like, one side that looks janky and one side that looks beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a question. This is done before we assemble it, or do we
Well,
go
there are
through
certain
the
things
lining?
like the collar and the cuff latch. I put the top stitching on before I put them into the garment. And that's why I showed it after we have the collar and the cuff latch constructed. Later down the road, you'll see that when we put the facing on, then we'll also go back and put the top stitching on the facing. Also, because next time we're going to be preparing the welt, because we're going to be sewing the welt pockets. We're going to be preparing the welt. And I like to also top stitch the welts for the pockets. So, it will occur at different stages in the construction. Okay. Okay. Yes. KJ.
Hi, Kenneth. I've got two Bernina questions
Yes.
with top stitching. Have you found any top stitching thread that works well in a Bernina? Okay, that's
As
good.
much as I love the
Me
Berninas,
neither.
and I do.
Just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed anything,
Yes.
being on the other side of the world.
Yes.
And my other question is, many of the Berninas that have been made in the last 15 years or so have a triple stitch. Have you experimented with that for top stitching? What do you think of it?
That, and I've done that with for jeans and such, and it's not the same. For this, I would not recommend it.
Thanks. Look, I haven't been able to get it to work well either. It always looks fun
I
to
mean,
me.
it looks like it looks like a workaround.
Yeah.
And so,
Thank you.
there are times when I kind of like the way it looks, but as a rule, now, if you can get your hands on an old featherweight, a Singer featherweight has the same hook system as the 301A.
Oh, any particular model or just any featherweight?
Well, any of the featherweights, and the 301A, I think it's just a straight stitch machine. It's one of those. I don't know quite how plentiful they are down there, but I imagine that they got there. But the featherweight has the same hook system, and I have actually used the top stitching in the featherweight, and because it has the same bobbin, the same hook, the whole bit, so it will do the same thing. So if you need any kind of an excuse to buy a featherweight, there you have it.
One.
But
Thank you.
But the 301A, I so adore that machine. That was one of those, because years and years and years and years ago, a dear friend of mine gave me his mother's 301A, or his grandma's 301A, and I had it for a number of years. And this lady at my church had fallen on hard times, and she thought, well, maybe she would take in some sewing to make some money. So she didn't have a sewing machine, and I thought, okay, I have so many machines, so I gave her my 301A. And later I heard that she didn't really do anything with it, and she just gave the machine away. I was like, why didn't you just give it back to me? So, there are times you just have to go, okay, be detached. You did the right thing, move on. So I was at the Goodwill. This is a few years back. I was at the Goodwill, and I walked in and I saw that the carrying case, what looked like the carrying case of this machine sitting on the counter. And I walked over, and sure enough, it was that machine. And I looked at and it was $85. And I kind of thought, oh, a little bit much, but okay, I would buy it. And so I had a t-shirt that I was buying as well. And the young lady behind the counter rang it up, and it came to $115. I said, how much is that t-shirt? And she said, $15. I said, I'm not paying $15 for a t-shirt at the Goodwill, so please take that off of the bill. And she hit a key, and then she got this look, and she kind of looked around, and I thought, I'm just going to stand here and act like I don't notice what's going on. And she hit the total, and she said, that'll be $42.50. I handed the card over, and I said, thank you. And I grabbed that case, and I ran out, and I hailed a cab, and I took it home. So, I eventually got it back. So, and really, that is what that machine does. That's all that machine does, is top stitching. I adore it. Okay, other questions?
So for the cuff latch, are we sewing a faux button on when we construct it? There's not a real buttonhole on there?
No, you'll have a real buttonhole on there. So you'll work the buttonholes, when you work your buttonholes.
Got it. So if we're doing bound buttonholes, do that now on the cuff latch?
Yes, I have other students in this class have been very ambitious and have actually made bound buttonholes on the cuff latch, and I take my hat off to them. And so what I would do with the bound buttonhole, there are two ways you could finish the back. You could, the old school way, which I would turn the other way, because really it is a nosebleed doing it finishing it the same way as you finish the facings, is you could either work a machine buttonhole that's going to sit behind there and whip stitch that, which is the easy, that's a secure way, or you could actually just make a slash and whip stitch the raw edges to the back of your buttonhole, because no one's going to see it. But you would want to make the buttonhole before you constructed the cuff latch. And also what you would probably consider doing is make the cuff latch about a quarter of an inch wider, just for balance, for scale, to get the buttonhole in there. But yeah,
I'll do machine stitches or machine buttonhole there.
okay, fair enough.
It's good to know it's possible.
Yeah. Okay. So other questions? Okay. So now KJ requested, this is like your treat today, because we have the time, and this was kind of a short lesson anyway. The intersecting seams. Now this is it's completely unrelated, but it's a really cool technique. And this is the technique that when I showed my students at FIT, this was a first. I had both classes called me a genius, which is, that never happens at FIT. So I will share that with you. And here we go. Having accurate intersecting seams is the mark of really good craftsmanship. What you look at here is you want the intersection to occur smoothly. You don't want any excess bulk raising one side or the other. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you too can make intersecting seam perfection. Start by marking your stitching lines on all 4 pieces of the intersecting seams. I've used pencil just for clarity. You could use other methods, but you want the stitching lines marked because these 4 corners have to line up perfectly. Next, we pin. We're going to be sewing 2 seams first and then the opposing seams later. You can choose to sew these 2 first or these 2 first. Doesn't really matter. So now, pinning. This is what is called pin basting. So put a pin right on that intersection. And you also want to bring the pin out right on that intersection. So you want those 2 intersections pinned together. So you're going to pin so that the pin holds both stitching lines, one on top of the other. And really, the best way to make sure that happens is by turning the work over and checking. I will finish pinning this one. I will pin the other one and bring it back here. Okay. We have both seams pinned. We are going to sew from here down to the intersection and back tack. I will take you over to the sewing machine so you can see what that looks like. We're here at the machine, and I'm going to be using green thread for the first set of stitching lines. So you can see sewing directly on. And with pin basting, you can grab the head of the pin and the fabric feeds under the foot pulls the fabric off the pin. So you don't have to worry so much about hitting the pin with your machine needle. Now, at this point here, and then we reverse. So you're going to sew backwards, I'd say about 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch. Very important. Back up your stitches there. You'll see why in a few moments. So I will sew the other seam, and then we'll meet at the pressing table. Here we have the 2 pieces that we've sewn. Now, to press, first you press as sewn. And then, with the seam roll, you press open. And you only press open, press from here back. Try not to put a crease here yet. If you get a little crease there, that's not going to kill you. Notice here, I'm pressing on a seam roll, highly recommended. Press the other one while I'm at it. There we are. We have both of these sewn, ready for the next step, which will occur back at the work table. Here we are. We have these 2 seams sewn, and before we sew the vertical 2, this is the crucial kernel of information you need to see. What I've done here is I've threaded up a needle with the matching thread. You want this to be the same color as the thread in your machine. That way, if you can't pull it out later, it doesn't really show. So what we're going to do here, we're going to put these together. Now, this is the key. I'm going to open up see those 2 threads right there? That is what we're going to catch. We want to sew those 2 together. Because see what you've done when you back tacked. Go. You don't want to pass through the fabric. You just want to catch the thread. So the thing is, when you back tacked, when you sewed in reverse, you created loops. These loops we're going to sew together. I'm just going to hold this back and stitch 3 or 4 times. What this will do is it will hold the end of this pair of rows of stitching together. Here we are. We've sewn both of those ends of the rows of stitching together. The next step is going to be sewing the 2 sides. Whereas we sewed up to here for the initial 2 rows, we're going to start our stitching here and sew away. And so what you want to do here, hold all of your seam allowances up and then pin baste. All the way down. Another little bit of insurance after you've pinned this, so that you make sure that these seams line up, you want to stitch, do a bar tack about a 1/2 inch in from the stitching line. This is going to come out later, so you can use a contrasting thread. So what you're doing, you're kind of stitching in the ditch of the seam. This is going to keep the layers from shifting when you're sewing. A lot of stitching, just needs to be a little. And so then what you'll do, we pinned here, you're going to push this back up here and pin. And that will keep this stable while you're sewing both rows of stitching. I'm going to take you over to the machine and demonstrate this. What's going to happen is that the needle is going to go in right there where you stitch those two ends of the rows of stitching together, and then we're going to sew forward. That's where we're going with this. So let's go over to the machine, shall we? So here we are. What you want to do, you want to bring the needle down right at the end of that row of stitching. I've changed the color thread so that you can actually see what we're doing. And so we're going to sew with a very short stitch, 0.5 to 0.75 for about a 1/2 inch, and then lengthen the stitch back to a standard length to continue. The short stitch and sewing away from this intersection is making it more secure, and you actually make sure that these two rows of stitching line up in the final product. Now, straight lengthen the stitch. That is one. And we'll go back to the work table, but first, let me show you here. It hits right at that intersection. So we'll go back to the work table and pin the other side. Pin all of those seam allowances back out of the way. And again, pin baste. You can actually hand baste with this if you wish. I don't discourage that. What I would say is hand baste with what's in the machine so that if the basting doesn't come completely out when you're taking the basting out, you don't see anything. So yes, again, we're going to start there on the machine and sew forward. So again, back to the machine. And again. There you go. Short stitch, start the stitching right on the machine stitching line. So for about 3/8 to 1/2 inch of the short stitch, lengthen the stitch back to your standard stitch. Again, you can see it hits dead on. And apologies for the manicure. Threads. Now we go to the pressing table. Before we press, we want to come in here and remove this little bar tack. And like I said, you use a contrasting thread because you want to get rid of that completely. So let's see, there's the knot. Okay. So now press both sides sewn. Now let's take a look and see what we have.
Nice.
Now if that thread was green, you wouldn't notice. But see how nice and square they intersect? That's what you're looking for. From here, again, seam roll, and we press each leg separately. So this one first. Press just up to the intersection. And then the other one here. Like so. Again, let's just revel in the beauty of this for a moment. Is that not beautiful?
Mm-hmm.
So next, we need to manage these seam allowances. Now, as a rule, you don't cut out this extra bulk for the reason that if you need to alter this size, if you need to let it out, if you need to take it in, if you've chopped out all of this excess, it limits what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
So this is somewhat of an origami thing. You're kind of mitering, and you can work them each separately. Like so. This will flatten everything out. It also, and when I turn it over on the front, you'll see it. It evens the tension. It flattens this out. It makes the intersection read flatter. So there are a number of reasons to manage your seam allowances like this. You're assuming this will be inside the garment. So this will be lined. So that is what it looks like on the back. That's what it looks like on the face. Back to the work table for just some finishing touches. To finish up, just a few catch stitches. You're just sewing through the seam allowances here. You just want these to hold everything flat so nothing gets distorted over the life of the garment. So yes, you can see here just a few catch stitches. And there we have it. We break your thread and we turn this over. Intersecting seams. Remarks? Yes, Vicky. I can't hear you, Vicky. You need to turn on your mic.
Okay, beautiful, excellent.
Yeah,
The miter is the genius for me.
It's a thing of
no,
beauty.
it just has, doing that makes everything all sit on the same plane, which, because if you start chopping seam allowances, sometimes you can get little hollows and puckers because of the layers. But for me, the crucial kernel of information is stitching the first two stitching lines together with that loop. That was the thing that when I figured that one out, I was like, Yes. So
Yeah.
that's what the students called out as genius, which yeah, it was. Not too bad, but you know. And this works. Okay, say for example, you're sewing, you have an invisible zipper down the back of a dress, you have a waist seam or a yoke, works the same. You know, you can get that because especially an invisible zipper, there's always like a millimeter. And you know, then you have to go back in and kind of woodgy around until you can get it. You don't ever have to do that. It just works. So question.
That's incredible.
Comments, requests? Because I think our work is done for today. But
Thanks,
don't
Kenneth. That was really amazing. Didn't see that coming. I was expecting some sort of pin hokey pokey, but no, that was awesome. Thank you.
You thought it was hokey pokey or what?
No, I thought when you talked about your intersecting seam trick, I was expecting it was going to be something involving a whole lot of pins and some sort of dodgy hokey pokey thing, but that was awesome. Thank you very much.
You know, my whole thing, and I tell my students this, because you know there are different people. See, I may have mentioned this person before. Actually, my dear friend Susan Calgi has also had the misfortune of interacting with this person. His name was Professor Rizzo. He's dead now. My mother always told me to speak good of the dead. He's dead. Good. There are people who kind of say, okay, they put a fence around, okay, what is couture and what isn't. And in cases of like this guy, it was what he knew was couture, everything else was not. And see, I had to kind of figure all this out on my own. And so, my whole thing is repeatable and reliable and as easy as I can make it. That's really what I'm after in anything I do, is because there's plenty of work to go around. But if I can make it so that there is less work, I'm good. And so, yeah, I didn't want, I mean, there are other fiddly ways of making intersecting seams match. But when I was thinking about this problem, when I realized, like, if you back tack, you can sew those lines together and they won't shift. That was, that for me was the revelation of the day. And, the clouds parted and the sun shone down and the angels sang and all of that. We all have those moments where we, get those bursts of brilliance. And that was mine for the week, that particular week. So I'm glad you enjoyed that. So questions, requests?
Can I ask one quick?
Yes, please do.
Just a quick question. If you weren't lining it, would you just overlock it then, or what would you do?
If
would you still do that same technique, or
I would line it.
You still line it.
I would line it, yeah. Because intersecting seam, that sort of, there's so much going on in there, and it can all.
Yeah, so you just would. Okay.
Yeah, you see, people think that lining is so much more difficult. Actually, lining is a seam finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are many, many times I will line something because it saves time.
Okay.
So in a case like this, it does save a lot more time just to have a lining in there. Because then you can kind of catch it down with some Frankenstein stitches, and the lining covers it. Because I had a student, because the kids are now working on their what's called their capstone collection, and so some of their critics are. I had this one student who she had a pucker kind of on her facing, and the critic was wanting her to take the whole thing out, and so she asked me what to do, and I said, "Oh, you make the lining cover it." And she looked at me and I said, "If it's inside a lining, it doesn't exist." And she just gave me this look, and I said, "I'll tell you what, if your critic catches you out on it, I will fix it for you." And the next week she showed it to him, and she took it back. She said, "He didn't notice." I'm like, if it's inside a lining, it doesn't exist. I have been in enough couture garments on the inside that sometimes they look a little bit rough and ready, but that's why you have a lining. Okay, so other questions? I know you kind of giggle like there are another story. I may or may not have told this years and years ago. I made this big, like 16 yards of blue velvet cape for a customer, and I like to interline velvet. I interline velvet with cotton flannelette. I think it's a really good idea. The other thing I like to do if I'm sewing with velvet is I like to use a slight zigzag. So the stitch length is like a 3.5, the zigzag is a 0.5, so that it has a little bit of stretch. Because the general rule when you're sewing thicknesses is the thicker the fabric, the longer the stitch. And sometimes the velvet will still want to pucker on a seam. But if you sew with a slight zigzag, you can kind of snap it and that pucker will release. And so the cotton flannelette gives a little more heft, and then you can also tack the seam allowances flat to the cotton flannelette. Well, in this particular cape, you know, you could buy cotton flannelette inner lining for like, I think it was like at the time it was like $8 or $9 a yard, or you could buy children's pajama flannel for like $1.99 a yard. And so which was I going to do? So the inside of that particular cape was teddy bears and toy trucks. And she came for the fitting and she looked on the inside and she said, is this the lining? No, you weren't supposed to see that. You just have to pretend you didn't see that. Because when the lining goes in, it doesn't exist anymore. So it's amazing what you see in the linings of things. Okay, so other questions? That's it? No other questions? Yeah, oh yes, Sonia.
I have a question. I feel a little bit overwhelmed with all the information, and I still feel that I need to know the steps of what I have to do. And I think you're showing us through the videos, but so that's how we should go for it.
Absolutely. So if you just follow the videos each week, do kind of what I'm showing you each week, at the end, you'll either have the coat finished or pretty well close to finished. Because you see, there are some people, you know, it's like, you know, if you give them the guide sheet, you know, it's sort of like, okay, it's my job to kind of show you how the whole thing goes together. Because see where we're going, if you'd like kind of an overview, because it doesn't hurt to just kind of see where we're going. Okay, so, you know, we have the collars, we have the cuffs. Next thing, we're going to be sewing the sleeves. We'll be constructing the facing, sewing the shoulder seams to the front facings. We'll be sewing the lining together. And so we'll have all the components. Then the sleeves go to the body. The collar goes onto the body. The facing goes onto the body. The lining goes in the body. That's kind of, you know, the rough outlines of how everything constructs. So, you know, it pretty much goes together like a coat will go together. So if that gives you some idea of kind of where we're headed in, you know, just to kind of see down the road, that's kind of the rough outlines. But what I like to do is I like to make all the parts and pieces and then assemble them. So that's kind of where we're going next. But next week and the following week, we're going to be preparing the welt pockets ready for installation. And then the following week is going to be installing the welt pockets. This is the deep dive. This is like the brain surgery of this particular coat. Everything else from there is downhill slope. And if you have ever taken a class where I've shown you my way of making a welt pocket, you'll be in very familiar territory. Because Sonia, I think you have probably taken that at some point. So
I think so.
Yeah. But you know, the nice thing about a video is, because see, one of the things I'm going to show you, if you remember from I showed you the video of the coat, how the pattern on the welt exactly matches the pattern on the coat. There's a whole thing you know, because see, it's all in the setup. You know, if you have the marking done, you have the setup right, when you put the two together and sew the pocket, it all works perfectly. So that's going to be the brain surgery. The next two classes, brain surgery. Then everything else is going to be downhill. Okay.
Hello.
Okay. So
Yeah.
yes, Mary.
So back in the day, I used to have to take dictation and type it out, you know, dictating machine, and we had the head on the whole thing. And the beauty of that was you can stop it, back it up, re-listen to it, the whole thing. So the beauty of these videos is if it's not already in your head, you can stop it at the moment, you can back it up, play it forward. And if you can write those stop it and say, this is the next step, this is the next step.
Mhm.
And I found when you write it out like that, it kind of reinforces it too.
Yeah.
But that's my way of learning. So
Well, and so, and see, also, this is why I send you the Zoom class and the links. So if you don't want to kind of slog through the entire class, you can just go to the link itself and, look at it. But yes, you and my students at FIT also use these, which is kind of nice. It's very strange hearing my own voice in my class. But I do the demonstration, and then they go over to their machine, and then they pull it up on their device, and then they run it over again. So the COVID had, we have to look at our silver linings, and that was one silver lining from the COVID. Okay, so other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to turn off the recording. I'll hang around for a few more minutes.